Okay, hi everyone. My name is Bo, and I am a engineering manager on the Microsoft Edge team, working on editing input and DOM. And with me, I've got.
Hi everyone, I'm Anupam and I'm also on the editing input and DOM team at Microsoft.
Okay. Let's see. Our objective for today is to try to make some progress on issues that we haven't closed yet related to controlling the virtual keyboard. We're also happy to identify any new issues if folks spot them as we give a presentation to sort of warm everybody up. We're also looking for collaborators if somebody wants to help us turn our explainers into a spec, and especially if you have experience doing that sort of thing. We're happy to collaborate with you. And so the way that we thought we'd go about it is doing a presentation and demo and then answering questions. We think the presentation takes somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, and then we'll get into issues discussion. So in terms of the scope, there's really two parts to the proposal. I'll start off with the first part. The first part is adapting the layout of a web page to changes in visibility for the virtual keyboard. And so here's an illustration that is a mock-up of a foldable device that has two screens. The black rectangles represent a left and a right screen of this device. And we use this dual screen device because it makes it really easy to see the problems. On such a device, if we don't adopt a proposal like we've put forth here, then we expect something like the following to happen. And I'll do this back and forth a few times just so you can see it. When the keyboard is coming up, what we're showing here is a reduction in the height of the visual viewport and a sliding up of the layout viewport. And so the layout of the page is unchanged, it's just shifted. And you can see that there's some space on the left screen that we've added to the bottom. And so this is so that we have room to shift the layout viewport up so that all of the content which is rendered within it is above the virtual keyboard. A couple of things are undesirable about this. Obviously, on the left screen, we are wasting some space. And the second thing that maybe is a little less obvious is that as the user pans around, because we now have a visual viewport that is smaller than our layout viewport, the user can take their finger and pan this content around so that they can see portions of the layout viewport that are not currently visible. And that gets a little bit awkward whenever you have sub-scrollers, which it looks like we have in this mock-up app, because sometimes your finger will pan and move the sub-scroller, while other times it will move the contents of the layout viewport itself. So we think that we can do better than this experience, and it requires some cooperation from the author. What we would like to have is this, and I'll just do that a few times. In here, what you see is that the visual viewport and the layout viewport are remaining unchanged, and that some portion of the web page is being relocated in response to the virtual keyboard showing. So here's the before and after. We think the after looks better than the before. And the way in which the author would cooperate with us in order to achieve the desired result is, in the current proposal, we have an opt-in mechanism accessible from script on a new virtual keyboard interface, which we have hung off of the navigator object. So the author says overlays content true, and it's named as such because now when set to true, when the virtual keyboard appears, if the author changes nothing about their page, the virtual keyboard will be overlaying and obscuring some of the content of the page. In order to adapt to that, we have some CSS environment variables. So here we're showing keyboard inset height is adjusting the bottom of that fixed position action bar that you saw moving up and down. And because I've got a dual screen device, you'll see the media queries just above it. There were some questions about, well, how do you know what screen the keyboard is showing on and when it's appropriate to be adapting your layout to it in foldable scenarios. So here we're borrowing a part of a separate proposal. It's not part of the virtual keyboard control, but we're borrowing CSS environment variables, using them in media queries to detect what mode we're in on the foldable and whether or not the position of the keyboard is on the right, or if you had a desire to adjust it on the left and so forth, you would add additional media queries like you see there. Okay, so that is the mechanism by which the author can adjust the page. Later in some code, you'll see that we have a JavaScript version of the events as well, instead of just CSS environment variables. The last point I want to make about adapting layout is that while I showed some demos on the dual screen device, we think it's equally applicable to single screen devices as well, so that when the keyboard comes up, this was an application that was sized maybe using viewport units to fit your viewport. And when the keyboard comes up, it's introduced some slop on the page so that the user can now pan it around. And like I said earlier with sub-scrollers, it's not necessarily a desirable experience. And so if you were to do something like this instead, you can see that the author relocates a portion of their page, and they could additionally, that looks like a sub-scroller region on the left that might have a list of messages. You could add some space to the bottom of that scroller to ensure that the user could swipe until all of the messages were up above the keyboard. That increases the layout stability and we think makes for a more usable application. So that's basically the pitch for part one. For part two, I'm going to turn it over to Anupam here. I'll just escape out of the presentation for a second. And he's going to demo some stuff about having the author control when the virtual keyboard is hidden or shown.
So in this demo, we have a new attribute on the element called virtual keyboard policy. And virtual keyboard policy has like two values, auto and manual. Virtual keyboard policy, if it's set to auto, it behaves just like the default editable element. So if user taps on the virtual keyboard policy auto, the keyboard comes up automatically. And if user taps on the read-only element, then the keyboard dismisses automatically. So web authors don't have to like handle anything when the focus is on the virtual keyboard policy auto with respect to the visibility of the keyboard. But for virtual keyboard policy equals to manual, this provides more control over the visibility of the keyboard. So if virtual keyboard policy manual is set to focus, it doesn't change the state of the keyboard. So if now the keyboard is hidden, if I set focus on the element with virtual keyboard policy as manual, it stays hidden. So it doesn't change the state of the keyboard. But if it's up and I switch focus to a manual policy element, it stays up. So virtual keyboard policy doesn't change the state of the virtual keyboard. And using the virtual keyboard policy as manual and this behavior, user can use APIs that we have defined on virtual keyboard to explicitly control the visibility of the keyboard. So they can call show and hide to show the virtual keyboard and hide the virtual keyboard when focus is on the element with virtual keyboard policy as manual. So I want to contrast the virtual keyboard policy manual with the input mode property. So there's been some confusion regarding input mode equals to none and the behavior of the input mode. Sorry. So when input mode equals to none is focused, at least on Windows, Firefox and Chromium, the behavior is pretty similar to what we saw for virtual keyboard policy as manual. So if I set focus on the input mode equals to none, as you can see, the keyboard state didn't change. And if the keyboard is already up, it stays up. But input mode equals to none is not interoperable, and it has a different behavior in iOS. So if the editable element has focus and input mode equals to none is specified, then the keyboard hides. To show the keyboard, you have to flip it to some other value. something other than none. But input mode really is an attribute that controls the shape of the virtual keyboard on Windows. So when input mode equals to numeric is specified, a numeric layout of the virtual keyboard is shown. So I'll show you an example where I use input mode equals to numeric and a virtual keyboard policy manual to show you how the input mode attribute works in conjunction with virtual keyboard policy manual. So if I switch focus to virtual keyboard policy manual type element with input mode numeric, and I pull up the keyboard manually, so using the icon on the shell, you see the virtual keyboard layout is still numeric, but the user, the author has explicit control over the visibility of the keyboard. So they can call virtual keyboard.hide right now to hide the keyboard, and they can call virtual keyboard.show to show the keyboard. So I'll show you in another demo how this thing works. Along with the overlay content. So in this demo, we have a keyboard icon over here that we use to call to explicitly like show and hide keyboard. And there's some content with editable element. And it has virtual keyboard policy attribute as manual. So if you set focus over here, you see the cat is rendered, but the keyboard didn't come up. And if you just select some content over here, also use creeper, yes. Select contents and tap on the keyboard icon. So the keyboard comes up automatically because the author calls virtual keyboard.show API that triggers the show. And you also saw that the selected content is positioned just above the keyboard, so it can be shown into view. And the scroll bar height also changes. Like if I dismiss the keyboard by pressing the keyboard icon again, you'll see that the scroll bar height changes too. So this is a much better user experience. I'll show you in code like how we are handling.
It's up in the head for the style. There you go. There you go. And then all the way down at the bottom, I think, is our script.
Yeah.
There you go.
So here I've set, oops. I've set overlay contents flag to true. And when author sets overlays content flag equal true, it ignores the default resizing of the visual viewport. So the visual view, when the keyboard shows up or gets hidden, the visual viewport and the layout viewport remains unchanged. So the author then can listen for geometry change event, which is the JavaScript event that Bo talked about. And this geometry change event can be used to listen for visibility changes. Like if the keyboard is shown, the bounding rect property on the virtual keyboard will have a height, which is greater than 0. And it will have, live DOM rect, which gets updated when the virtual keyboard is shown or hidden. And this toggle keyboard is the keyboard icon that I tapped on to show or hide keyboard. It basically checks for this bounding rect property, and if it's greater than 0, that means the keyboard is shown. The author calls hide to hide the keyboard, and if it's not, then we show the keyboard. We also use CSS environment variables to position the content above the keyboard if the content is occluded by the keyboard, or you want to position some portions of the web page. So you can use this environment variable keyboard inset height to like set the position of the grid template rows, which are basically the content that you're seeing on the editable element. And then we use the geometry change event to also like set the selected content into view so that it doesn't get occluded by the virtual keyboard. So that's pretty much it for the demo. I think we should switch to questions. So I'll hand it over to Bo.
All right. Change the chairs back. Okay. All right, so let's see here. If I pop back to the presentation for a second. So what we showed was the hide and show API to control the virtual keyboard visibility along with the virtual keyboard policy attribute, an opt-in mechanism so that you don't change the layout or visual viewport when the keyboard is shown or hidden, and new events and environment variables to adapt your layout. Before we get into any issues discussions, does anybody just have any questions about what we were showing?